Hello folks, this is Miss Summers with your notes today. Today is a day, it is October 15th. No, it is not, excuse me, it's October 22nd, LOL. Lols, October 15th was last week. But it's October 22nd, and we're talking today about watersheds, river basins, and wetlands. So we want to describe the different kinds of wetlands, particularly those that are in North Carolina. We want to describe watersheds and river basins and explain how people can affect wetlands and why that's a problem. Okay, so if you have your outline, follow along with me. If you don't have your outline, just take notes as you normally would. But I will be referring to the questions on that outline throughout. Okay, so let's start on slide 2 with what is a watershed. So here we have our definition in yellow. A watershed is an area where all the water that falls in it drains off and goes to a common outlet like a lake, stream, or marsh. All right, so watershed, an area of land that water falls on and drains to a common outlet. A watershed, okay, so our second question, a watershed is like a bathtub. So we have this diagram over here. All right, a bathtub is like a watershed because all the water that falls in it, okay, all the water that falls within the sides of the bathtub all drain to one spot. In this case, it would be this little drain right here. All right, if I were to take a glass of water and pour it into the tub over here, or pour it into the tub over here, or pour it into the tub over here, it would all go to this drain eventually. But if I take a glass of water and I pour it over here, outside of the tub, it's not going to make it to the drain because it's in a different watershed. All right, watersheds are divided by a watershed divide. It's not very uniquely named. A watershed divide is the imaginary line that separates a drainage basin. Okay, so usually this is a ridge of high land. So on a bathtub, it would be the sides of the bathtub. If you want to imagine one, if you want to see one like IRL in real life, if you imagine being here at the Lake Norman High School, okay, and you're leaving school and you take a right onto 150, like you're driving towards downtown Mooresville. All right, you're driving along and you pass like the Target and stuff, and then you get to that stoplight where Williamson meets 150, and there's like the Walgreens and the CVS and all that mess. If you've ever noticed, you kind of have to go up a little hill to get to that stoplight. But if you're sitting at that stoplight, like where the old Panera used to be, everything in front of you is downhill. You're sitting on top of the watershed divide at that stoplight, okay? The water behind you, if the water were to fall behind you while you're sitting at that stoplight, it would fall into the Catawba River. The water in front of you, going down the hill the other side, that would end up in the Yadkin-Pedee River. All right, so that's a divide. So we have a diagram here showing what that looks like. Here's our ridge of land. So they're kind of like little hills and whatnot. And then the common outlet is usually a river that drains into a lake or an ocean or something like that. All right, how's that different than a river basin? So I'm not going to lie, I usually use the word watershed and river basin kind of interchangeably. The only thing that's different about river basin is that it's draining to a river specifically as opposed to a lake or a marsh or a swamp or something like that. Does everybody live in a river basin? The answer to that is yes. Everybody lives in a river basin, even if you don't live near water, okay? Because water always goes downhill. It's always going to find somewhere lower to flow to, okay? Some river basins are really, really large, like the Mississippi River Basin or the Missouri River Basin, all right? That starts way out in, I want to say Montana, and it goes basically all the way over to like where the Appalachian Mountains are, and it funnels from the very northern part of the United States up near the Canadian border is, all the way down to the Gulf of Mexico. Okay, all that water eventually drains to the Mississippi River. So a lot of people can influence it even if they're not nearby. All right, so here's some funsies facts about river basins in North Carolina. There are 17 total. Do I need you to remember them? Absolutely not. That would be silly. I do want you to know that we live in the Catawba River Basin, which makes sense because we live right next to Lake Norman. which is a part of the Catawba River. All right, that lake wasn't always there. We kind of made that lake by stopping the river at one end by building a dam. Yeah, so there we are. We are right here on the border between these two river basins. So most of us live over here. Some of our friends may live over yonder. Okay? All right, so that's a river basin and a wetland, or a river basin watershed. We'll talk more about rivers tomorrow in greater detail. A wetland is what we're focusing on today. A wetland is an area where water covers land all or part of the time. Okay, so you may always have this kind of shallow covering of water, or you may have seasonal variations where sometimes the ground is covered and sometimes it's not. All right, if we look at this map, we have different types of wetlands, and if I look at this map in North Carolina, all right, blue represents deep water habitat, so like there's Lake Norman, that's Lake Wiley, etc. The green areas are predominantly wetland, and if you look, it asks where the majority of wetlands in North Carolina are located. It's along the coast or in the coastal plains. All right, in the coastal plains. Now, we have different types of wetlands, and I want you to know the 3 main types. There's actually 5 main types, but the 3 I'm going to talk about can be found specifically in North Carolina. Okay? So, our first type of wetland is an estuary. So, I definitely need you to write down the name and then the characteristics. So, an estuary is a type of wetland where river water, fresh water, mixes with salt water. That creates a water that's called brackish. That's B-R-A-C-K-I-S-H, brackish. So it's like half salty, half fresh. And estuaries are a really important ecosystem because it's between 2 different habitats. It's between the ocean and a river. So a lot of animals will migrate there occasionally to either get food or like our little friend over here, this is a bull shark. Bull sharks have this really neat ability. They don't always have to be in salt water. So what they will do, mommy bull sharks will go have their babies in estuaries generally because they're safer from big predators there. It's like a little nursery, if you will. Okay? Hence why there's usually sharks kind of hanging out near rivers. They're either looking for food or they're taking care of their babies. All right, so that's an estuary. Our next type of wetland that we have in North Carolina is very common along the Outer Banks, are the marshes. A marsh is a freshwater wetland that contains non-woody plants like grasses. All right, so they're kind of like these big fields. They're usually almost always covered with water for the most part. And marshes are an important habitat for nesting birds. So this is a heron. So if you've ever seen like a heron or a crane, chances are it's settling, it's making its little nest and raising its babies in this marshy environment. Okay? And our last type of wetland is a swamp. Okay, so you might think of these more like in Florida or Louisiana, like down in the bayou country. But we have them here in North Carolina too. These wetlands are different. They're still freshwater like a marsh, but they have woody plants and shrubs. So they'll have trees. It's more like a forest as opposed to a field. These trees provide habitats and hiding places for lots of animals, especially like these, like classic swamp animal right here, good old American alligator. They use these places to kind of hide and wait to ambush their prey. Okay, so we have estuaries, marshes, and swamps. Now, you might be looking at these places, like this place, and even this place, and you're like, the ground's always wet. I can't really build anything here. So, like, how is it helpful? What do wetlands provide? All right, well, they actually play a really important role for not just for like other animals, like for the animals that live in them, but they also are helpful to humans. All right, so we're actually really happy that they're here. Wetlands can prevent flooding by holding water like a sponge. If it rains a whole bunch, water will collect in a wetland and stay there, as opposed to flooding out. Wetlands have this really snazzy ability to control water quality. So polluted water can enter into a wetland, and those pollutants will get filtered out. The water that comes out ends up being cleaner than it is when it goes in. Wetlands also provide a natural source of erosion control. Remember from Little Geosphere Part 1, water can erode things, and we want to minimize erosion. Those habitats do so. And then, of course, as we talked about with our 3 different types of wetlands, we talked about 3 different types of animals. We talked about sharks and birds and alligators. They're a wildlife habitat. And even though, we might not use that animal directly, okay, like I don't eat frogs. Frogs live in lots of wetlands. Frogs are an important part of the ecosystem. They help control bug populations. All right, so just because you don't use an animal directly doesn't mean it's not important. And then, of course, wetlands provide natural products for the economy. So timber, what's that show called? Swamp Loggers. That's a show on whatever channel it's on. People will hunt animals, like shellfish or alligator, things like that. Okay, so there's lots of reasons we want to preserve wetlands and keep them around. We don't want to get rid of them. But unfortunately, humans, us being who we are, we do things that aren't necessarily beneficial for the environment, and wetlands are no exception. All right, so now we're on slides 12 through 15, friends. Humans and wetlands. Our first question, what happens if a wetland is continually polluted? Okay, so we said that wetlands can process pollution, they can clean the water, but there's only a certain point they can do that to. If a wetland is continually polluted, it will experience degradation, which means it degrades, it gets lower in quality over time, which is what's happened here. You can see there's lots of plastic waste and stufferkins in this water that people put there, and the environment cannot break that down. All right? We have a major problem with decrease in wetlands. So I want you to think about, why are people converting wetlands to non-wetlands? What human activity is doing that? And the answer to that is people are usually doing that to build stuff. Okay, to either build houses or commercial space or farms. All right, so remember, if you looked at a picture of a marsh, well, you can't build a house there. You couldn't build a neighborhood there because there's always water. But as people need more space because there's more people in general, that's one of those habitats that gets encroached upon. Over the course of our history as a nation, the United States has lost over half of its original wetlands, and we continue to lose 100,000 wetland acres a year. All right, so we have this pretty picture of a map of the United States from the 1780s to the 1980s. So this doesn't even take into account the last 40 years. All right. But you can see these states that are heavily populated, like California, they've lost a lot of wetlands. Here in the Midwest, all right, you might see a lot of sort of like farming area out here. Those wetlands have been converted to agrarian land? Agriculture, farms. Y'all get what I'm saying. Okay? So over the past 40 years, you can imagine this has only gotten worse over time, because more and more people are living here. This is a continuation. Urbanization is what destroys wetlands. They are drained to make more spaces. What would happen if wetlands continue to be destroyed? So whenever I ask this question, I want you to think about, well, how do wetlands help us? If wetlands are destroyed, they're no longer able to provide the services that they do for humans. So if wetlands are destroyed, you're going to have more flooding, more erosion, lower water quality, less habitat. All right, all those are negative things. We definitely don't want that. Okay? So that is our wetland notes today. Tomorrow we will talk about rivers, so make sure that you are up and up on the river basins. And I'll see you then.